going to be using the red, blue, and yellow for now for this page. You guys can try these techniques with your glitter or your metallic or whatever kind of watercolors you have. So I've got a brush, I've got some water, mix up some color. You would probably do this on your plastic sheet, mixing up your color. I'm just going to do it in the lid of the Altoids can. I want to work out of the color that I'm mixing in my mixing tray, whatever that is for you, and not out of the pigment. Please remember that watercolor is supposed to be wet. It gets goopy and sticky, and it stays goopy and sticky forever if you work the other way. I'm actually going to do the flat wash first. The flat wash is just what it sounds like. You just make a flat, even wash of color of one color. And it's good to always have some paper towels close to you so that you can kind of dry off your brush a little bit if needed. And then if you have an area where you need to lift up some of your wash, then you can do that. You create what a watercolor artist calls a thirsty brush. A thirsty brush is just a dry brush. So a flat, even wash, you just keep your paper flat, and the goal is to get all the colors even. And hopefully that will dry flat. It's got a glare on it so it doesn't look flat to you, but hopefully you'll be able to see it. The next one I'm going to do is the Grated Wash that's right beside it. When you get ready to do yours, it does not matter if you do them in the same order that I have done them. It makes absolutely no difference. For a Grated Wash, I get plenty of pigment and water on my brush, and I make a nice bead of color. And then I'm going to clean my brush off, and I'm going to use just water to wash down the page. And then in theory, if I don't put it back in the pigment, I made my brush thirsty again, and I'm removing this extra water down here so it doesn't get into the next one. Then you can see how it's darker right here, and it gets gradually lighter. So I've got mostly pigment, and then clean my brush off. It's the same exact thing, but I'm making sure that I kind of add just water, no more pigment, because I'm trying to make a shaded line, and then I can kind of smooth that out. It's the exact same thing as a Grated Wash. I'm just putting it into the shape of something. So if I were doing a painting that had flower petals, in order to make the flower petals look like they are actually curved, they're going to be darker along at least one edge, if not two edges, and then brighter in the middle. So I'm going to start with coarse salt. So pretty much every technique starts with a wash. So I'm going to make a wash. And then while my wash is still wet, I want to give it a second. While it's still basically wet, I want a tiny pinch of salt, and I'm just going to sprinkle some of the coarse salt. And you can kind of see, if you look, what's happening. I'm going to allow that paint to completely dry with the salt on it. And then when it's totally dry, I will remove the salt, and it'll have little like blooms around where the salt was. It'll be dark in the center, and then it'll have a bright bloom around it. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the table salt underneath it, so that you can see the difference between the two. You won't really be able to see the difference until it's dry. And when I turn this into a video, I will include a photo in my video that has the finished paper. So I've got my wash, and I take the table salt this time, and it's still a tiny little bit. And I'm just sprinkling a tiny little bit in there. And you can see the only difference really between the coarse salt and the table salt is the size of the little centers that you are gonna end up with. And again, you won't really see what's gonna happen with that until it's totally dry. Now I'm gonna move to the alcohol. Again, I'm gonna make a wash. You could put like rubbing alcohol into a little, like a little tiny spray bottle or something, and it would work pretty cool. But with the alcohol, you're just gonna drop little bits into the paint, and it just creates a texture. And then when it dries, you'll have like little rings that are different values in the watercolor. So that's an interesting way to make marks with the watercolor. All right, the next one is a tape resist. If I want to preserve an area as white or whatever color, it doesn't even matter what color, but if I want to preserve an area, then I could put a piece of tape over it. I can actually like create drawings with tape. I'm not gonna make anything super extravagant here because I'm just demonstrating, but I could actually like make a thing out of tape. And mine is gonna be extremely not extravagant. So I've got my tape down. I'm just gonna take my paint that I've created and do my wash right over the tape. And then that's another one where you won't really see the effect until it's dry. And when it's dry, I'll remove the tape and you'll see the white underneath. So wax resist, they actually make wax and other resist materials for this purpose, but I'm actually drawing lines with the crayon. And then I'm gonna do my wash over the top of that. And I might make my brush thirsty. What does it mean when I say thirsty brush? That you've dried it off some so that it'll soak up the water, the excess water. And then when that dries, I can clean off the little bits that are on top of the wax. But you can see that it's only sticking, the paint is only sticking to the part that does not have wax. Dry brush. It means don't dip your brush in water first and just try to barely get pigment on your brush so that you can create a dry brush look. And it's really just a scratchy. This is a great way if you're trying to make grasses or something like that to use a dry brush effect, maybe some hair or something, and it just makes it have a totally different look than if you are using a wet brush. Okay, next I'm gonna use the straw to create some movement. And I'm gonna put down some color. A pretty good puddle of color. And then I'm gonna use my little straw to literally just blow the paint and make it move. That's all there is to that. Okay, the next one is splatter. You can use a brush that has fairly stiff bristles to do a splatter. You can also use a toothbrush. A toothbrush works really well. Some of the older brushes, especially the ones that have black bristles, work really well for splatter. A controlled splatter, you flick the bristles. You can use your brush, and I'm just gonna kind of demonstrate up in the air and not on the paper. You can put paint on your brush, put your finger out like this and tap to make a splatter. Maybe I can do it on here. The splatters are gonna be bigger. Okay, the next one is wet on wet. I am wetting my paper with clean water. And then I'm gonna take some pigment. And I'm just gonna drop it in. And did y'all see what happened? It just kind of bleeds out and makes little blooms. You can also do that on a color. If you have a color that's already there and it's still wet, then you could purposely make little blooms of other colors within that color. But this can also accidentally happen. So if you're trying to make a clean, crisp line, it is extremely important that your paper is dry. I'm doing the same motion that I just did on the wet on wet, but instead of blooming, it's just making dots. Y'all see the difference between wet paint on dry paper and wet paint on wet paper. The next one is scored lines. Just scratch my paper. And then I'm gonna do a wash over the scoring. And you can see that I have really fine lines that are darker just by using the scoring method. The next technique is plastic wrap. I'm just gonna put a wash down. I think again that this one works best with maybe a little bit darker color. So I've got a wash down, then I put the plastic down on it and I just kind of wrinkle it up. This is another one where you don't have a whole lot of control, and when that is dry, I will remove the plastic and you'll see what it did to the paint. It'll be darker where the wrinkles are and lighter where the plastic is touching. And then the last technique is a tissue lift. Make another wash. This one can be useful to you if you mess up, and it can also be useful to you if you're doing something where you want it to look kind of wispy or cloudy. I'm just taking my thirsty brush and getting rid of a little bit of that. You basically just take the tissue, wad it up, press it down. We're not rubbing it, I'm just pressing it and lifting it. And I have created a shape. We're gonna do this in our sketchbook because this is basically note taking.